Hi everyone. I wanted to give a quick sort of review of a film I just watched on Netflix called Headshot. And you'll have to excuse me if I butcher the names here, but it was an Indonesian film shot in 2016, and according to IMDb database, is directed by Kimo, Stamboel, and Timo, Tjahjanto. And I'm not sure if I'm saying those right. Probably not. You'll have to forgive me if there are any Indonesian people who sort of curled up and died inside listening to me murder those Indonesian names. Um, Regardless, I really liked the film. I saw it on Netflix, and despite the fact that Netflix right now is having some issues with its rating system, it was able to actually recommend a movie to me that I really liked. It's been a while since I've actually watched something based on the recommendation system that Netflix has right now. Evidently, even though you have the thumbs up and thumbs down system, you can still read reviews with a star rating system. So in this case, I got recommended this to me, and it didn't really, it was hard for me to determine if this would be any good or not, but then I started reading some of the reviews that people write themselves, and it sounded like it might be fun to watch. So I sat down and watched it, and I have to say I enjoyed it quite a bit. Again, I'm a sucker for foreign cinema. When it comes to gangster movies, I love French gangster movies. When it comes to Korean films, for instance, I think they make some really good movies. In general, I saw The Devil, The Admiral, Mother, The Berlin File, A Company Man, The Man from Nowhere, No Tears for the Dead. I mean, these are all really good films. Flew, The Train to Busan, all sorts of movies like that that I would never watch normally. I have a chance to watch on Netflix. And this movie, Headshot, was really good. I liked it for a lot of reasons. And of course, I've been having a lot of discussions about what constitutes a great movie. And a lot of people tell me that, a great movie is something that is iconic, that casts a long shadow in the sense that you have Beethoven, who spearheaded the Romantic movement in classical music. Then you had Brahms, and Brahms said that Beethoven cast a long shadow, the idea of having sort of a musical legacy of sorts. And the same idea with films, where I had someone telling me that Blade Runner is this great, amazing movie because it had this long sort of legacy, and it, despite the fact that it may have had some stumbles in the box office, was able to sort of grow and sort of establish itself later on as this canonical masterpiece. And I'm certainly one for saying that it's a very well-made film. I like it a great deal. At the same time, when I watch movies, I don't just feel satisfied with celebrating the films that are established classics. Yes, you have them. You have movies like Psycho, but you also have movies like Peeping Tom. You have a movie like The Lost Boys, not that I'm saying that that's a classic in the same sense, but then you have something that's slightly less well known, like Near Dark, which came out the same weekend. It was directed by Catherine Bigelow, and it was one of her better films. You probably know her for directing The Hurt Locker. Well, she also directed Near Dark. And there are a lot of movies like that that sort of get swallowed up in the shadows of these great classics. And I'm not saying that these great classics don't deserve the praise that they get, but there are so many movies out there to enjoy. And there's more to being a good film, in my opinion, than just being a classic that you can say as well. This is obviously a classic, and we can demonstrate it through 30 years of influencing cinema and pop culture and all of these other things. It's like, okay, great, fine, that's all good and wonderful, but as far as I'm concerned, you can also just appreciate something for being a well-made movie. It doesn't have to break any new ground, but ultimately, if you examine Blade Runner, was it really breaking any new ground? I mean, yeah, it's a visually well-made film, and it's an interesting adaptation of a novel by, oh, what was his name? Who wrote that? Philip K. Dick. do androids dream of electric sheep? And yet it's different, and it takes some liberties with the material, and it sort of evolves into its own thing. And yes, it's very influential and all that, but is it the most entertaining movie? I think it's a very well-made film. It makes a lot of interesting arguments, but in regards to it being entertaining, there are other movies out there that I think are more fun to watch. I'm not saying that I don't enjoy watching it, and that, you know, the sets, for instance, are really impressive, the performances are really impressive, but there's more than one reason to watch a film. And again, a film can be a classic in the sense that Blade Runner is, or it can just be a really entertaining movie, like The Monster Squad, for instance. They're not symmetrical, and yet I feel that one film is more entertaining for me than the other, despite the fact that you could certainly make the argument that yes, one is arguably a lot more influential than the other. As far as I'm concerned, when I sit down and watch The Monster Squad, I have a good time in a way that I don't necessarily have when I watch Blade Runner, which essentially sort of implies that there's more than one reason to watch a film. Okay, so if I sit down and watch Blade Runner, I can say, oh, look at this film, it's great. In the same sense that my professor told me that she can sit down and analyze A Man in the Sea or other pieces of writing by the person who wrote that, whose name I'm forgetting, The Old Man and the Sea. That was by Ernest Hemingway. Okay. So, for instance, she can analyze Ernest Hemingway all day long, or she can analyze, I don't know, Faulkner or T.S. Eliot. You know, authors like that. She can sit down and analyze them and appreciate them for, you know, the classic structure of their writing and the liberties that they take with structure. Or you have someone like Walt Whitman who sort of moves away from the standard practices of, I don't know, something like iambic pentameter or versed poetry, and you have something akin to free verse, where there are a lot less rules and you can do what you want. And there are certain things to appreciate by in regards to these canonical sort of figures in literature. So if she can do that with Ernest Hemingway, for instance, then I can sort of do that with Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. And again, Ridley Scott is a director who's made many films, and certain films that he's made, like Blade Runner, are films that are classics, but are they always the most entertaining pictures when you compare them to other movies? In the sense that a movie can be entertaining to watch and far more fun, or you can have a film like Blade Runner, which isn't exactly, you know, barrels of fun. You know, it's not a barrel of laughs. I like it, and there's a lot to appreciate, but there's more to watching a movie, I think, than just that. So yes, people will make the argument, oh, that the movies have to aspire to this acme of canonical sort of nirvana. It's like, yes, you can have that, but you can also just sit down and watch a movie. And in regards to um, Headshot, which I just watched, I found it to be really entertaining. And it was actually really well made, too, in the same sense that you watch a movie like Aliens by James Cameron. It's a very well made film, but it doesn't necessarily always feel to me as a great sort of classic in the sense that maybe Blade Runner is, you know, because there's more than one way to be a classic film. Sometimes the movies are just really entertaining. You know, a film like Caddyshack, for instance, is a very entertaining movie, but would you put it in the same sort of category as Blade Runner? It's like, yeah, it's a classic film, but has it been quite as influential in its own genre as Blade Runner has been in the science fiction genres, even just movies at large? Because again, you know, it sort of riffs off noir stories as well, and then, you know, it's not just a science fiction story, as is often the case with Ridley Scott. There's a lot of symbolic elements. So there's a lot of different reasons to watch films and appreciate films. So when someone says that Blade Runner is this classic movie and all that, I can agree with them, but I can also say yes, but you need to watch other things too, as far as I'm concerned anyways. You know, it's like I could spend all day talking about why Blade Runner is a good movie, but it doesn't change the fact that sometimes I just rather watch something like Headshot, for instance. And why do I like Headshot? Again, it's very well shot. There is a lot of instances in the film where I thought to myself, you know, this is just photographically interesting. For instance, there's a point early on in the film when the hero is in a hospital bed. It's a bird's eye view shot, and you have the nurse who's diligently watching him as he's recovering from a gunshot wound to the head. It's a bird's eye view shot, and you have essentially a shot of her on the couch reading Moby Dick, of all things, and she falls asleep, and then it's a slow fade, and then the lighting changes and she is in a different position on the couch, in the same sense that maybe um, John Hurt sort of slowly faded from him sitting up as he got out of the sleep chamber in Alien, and then he slowly gets up and you have the slowly fading shots. You know, it's a classic sort of film technique in regards to photography, and then again it's a bird's eye view shot. And this was just one instance in the movie where I'm like, you know, this is photographically interesting. And this is supposed to be kind of a Quentin Tarantino style grindhouse film in certain aspects, ostensibly. I mean, it's a film called Headshot, and like you look at the cover, and it's the title of the film is written in red blood and it's splattery, but there's actually some artistic sort of credence to the man holding the camera, and I can really appreciate that. And you know, there's some comic book style sort of stuff going on in regards to the visuals, but there's also a strong element to the human characters, you know, the human drama. And you have the mysterious stranger who washes up on the shore with a gunshot wound to his head, which again is sort of mysterious, and you wonder why. It seems almost kind of out of place. It's like, okay, this guy gets shot in the head and he washes up on shore like a mythical sort of figure, and he's rescued by a fisherman who takes him to the nurse, who nurses him back to health, and he survives from his injury. And he can't quite remember his past. Now, if this sounds familiar to other examples in maybe, I don't know, spaghetti westerns, where you have the mysterious stranger who is nursed back to health and then has to sort of fight to save the damsel in distress in one of those films, it's not really that far removed from that. And when I was watching Headshot, I thought to myself, you know, if I had to think of one movie that really sort of reminded me of this film, as I was watching it, it would be Ninja Scroll, where you have the bad guy, right? And you have the hero. And the hero is, again, someone you don't really know a lot about. And he is pitted against a villain who has a whole sort of array of henchmen with individualized gimmicks. You know, each villain had his own sort of superpower, and in that movie, you had Tasai, who could turn himself to stone, and he had his boomerang sword, and he kills all the ninjas at the start, and he's like a total badass. And then, of course, you had the bee guy, and the guy who could move through shadows, um, and the blind swordsman, where they have the duel in the bamboo forest, and they have to defeat him without being able to see. Your sight is a weakness. And it wasn't quite that cartoonish in this film, obviously. It's actually a fairly grounded film in terms of its action. But there are characters who are introduced who, say, fight with a knife. And then there's one character who fights with a combat baton. And they establish this, you know, they build up the film and they introduce the cast of sort of supporting characters one at a time that sort of revolve around the central sort of antagonist. And at the same time, you have the hero is being nursed back to health. And of course, the nurse is reading Moby Dick for whatever reason. And when she asks the hero, when he resumes consciousness, what is your name? He looks over at a board, and she has drawn Ishmael with a little whale on this what would you call it, a dry erase board with markers like they have in classrooms, or at least they used to. When I was in college, they replaced the classic sort of blackboards with chalk with white dry erase boards. And he looks at that dry erase board and he sees Ishmael, so he says, "Call me Ishmael." is the movie really largely concerned with the chasing of the white whale and other symbolism sort of present in the novel. Not necessarily, but it was sort of a nod or allusion to Moby Dick, even if it doesn't make up the core of the film. It doesn't have to. What matters is that the movie is entertaining, and again, you have just enough time to sort of establish a bond between the nurse and Ishmael before things go wrong and the nurse is captured. And the villain, of course, takes his time finding the hero. At first he thinks he's dead, and then he discovers through a crime deal, like a drug deal gone wrong, some business associates decide to betray him, so he and his cronies decide to kill all of them except for one, who, pleading for his life, says that so-and-so is in the hospital. And it allows us to sort of learn about the plot of the movie one piece at a time. And for all intents and purposes, when we first see the antagonist, he escapes from jail in a pretty elaborate escape sequence that's extremely violent and very well shot. And I loved it, the way it opens, and the police officers have him in a jail cell sealed off from everyone else, and they're sort of goading or gloating at him, saying, oh, well, you know how hard we work to capture you. And then, of course, there's someone mopping the hallway behind the guards as they're standing in front of this door, and the villain is sort of responding to their taunts by saying, oh, well, you think that you have me where you want me, and you don't. And as he's sort of leading them along, someone, the individual who's mopping the hallway, takes a knife or a shiv out of the bucket, stabs one of the guards, and steals his weapon, and it starts this chain reaction where essentially you have this really sort of long and protracted gunfight. Well, I say long and protracted, there's a lot going on, and it lasts longer than you might think. But it's still over relatively quickly. What I mean is, he doesn't just point the gun, boom, 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 and shoot the guards. They take a certain amount of time firing back and forth. And again, the point is they're focusing the camera on a lot of this violence, and that's how this movie kind of works, is you have people who are shooting each other, and they don't just shoot each other quickly and then it's over. It's the same sense as Old Boy, for instance. You have a fight in the hallway. Well, it's not just a couple of punches. It's a long sort of choreographed fight. And you have the camera just sort of watching as this fight unfolds. And even at the start of the film, they sort of establish this in headshot when the individual takes the shiv out of the bucket, he stabs the guard, and he takes his weapon, and then they have a gunfight. Rather than just shoot the guards and have it be over in a matter of seconds, they decide to sort of draw it out a little bit. And then after the villain escapes from his cell, he hands all of the cellmates who have fled their cells at this point weapons from the now deceased guards, and he says, go, you're free. So all the cellmates who are now armed take their weapons, and they sort of file out into the antechamber leading out into the main body of the prison, where they are confronted by a wall of guards, a firing squad, essentially, who are waiting for them. And they all kill each other in a firefight, all of the guards and all of the liberated or emancipated cellmates. So they're all dead, and the villain sort of is taking his time at this point, you know, sort of adjusting his tie, you know, he's wearing a suit, and he's just sort of taking his time while the cellmates and the guards are killing each other. And it really illustrates who this guy is without really having a lot of dialogue. And this movie is really good at doing that. And at this point, we don't know anything about the hero. And when we first meet the hero, again, he's a body that washes up on shore with a bullet in his brain. And as the movie progresses, there's no exposition. It's all told entirely through things that happen directly in front of us. And when something happens, we learn a little bit more about him, and we learn a little bit more about his relationship to the villain at the start of the film. Because at the start of the film, we haven't seen the hero yet, we don't know anything about the villain, and it takes its time to sort of slowly reveal things to us in regards to, okay, how are they connected? And the movie shows us bit by bit, and it kind of takes its time, and every scene teaches us a little bit more. For instance, with the crime deal gone wrong, not only are we introduced to a lot of the supporting villains the lady with the knife, the guy with the combat baton, but we also learn through the one surviving bad guy of that crime deal who sort of betrays the main antagonist that, hey, this guy's in the hospital, this body washed up on shore, and then suddenly the main antagonist is like, well, wait a second, you know, and so he has his newfound lackey, his newfound backstabbing lackey, go and investigate. And then this is the kind of character who is very, very much someone that you know is sort of a toady, and he's kind of sleazy, and he's very obnoxious, and you're just waiting for him to get killed. And eventually he does. And characters in this movie, again, how I explained that it has a tendency to sort of feel like Ninja Scroll, for instance. Well, that was a very violent film, so apart from having a very disparate and varied cast of supporting villains, apart from a central protagonist and a central antagonist, and a damsel in distress, like that movie, you also have extreme and copious amounts of ultraviolence. It's just nonstop violence, and again, instead of having the villain freed at the start of the film with just the firing of 3 or 4 bullets, you have essentially 2 major gunfights, and they're shot in a very stylish fashion, and at the same time, the movie isn't just nonstop violence. Again, when the hero is recovering at the start of the film, there's a certain sort of changing of pace. And when the hero recovers and wakes up and we learn about him, the movie takes enough time to sort of slow down and hand out these pieces of information, and then it'll switch gears again and have another violent sort of fight scene, but it doesn't feel taxed on. It doesn't feel tacked on. It feels sort of cohesive, and it flows, and it never really drags. And the time that it uses is very economical and smart, because it takes the time when it slows down to introduce us to the nurse, to introduce us to the hero, and it has them spend enough time on screen together to get us to sort of care about them. Now, I will say that this isn't always necessary, because again, this type of hero, the mysterious hero, you don't always have to know a lot about them. Again, the Clint Eastwood sort of archetypal gunslinger, you don't always know very much about him, and that's sort of the appeal behind the character. But in this particular instance, you have that basic idea, and then you sort of play off the idea of amnesia, where the character has been shot in the head, and eventually you learn about the character. I don't care what movie you're watching. If you watch a film like Alien, or you watch a film like Jaws or Michael Myers, where you don't initially know a lot about the character, the antagonist in that case, eventually you're going to learn more about them. In the same sense that if you watch Unforgiven with Clint Eastwood, you don't really know a lot about the character right off the bat, but as the movie progresses, you are fed little bits of information or bits of exposition or flashbacks, what have you, that explain the true nature of this individual. Now, certain movies don't always take the time to do that, and it's not always necessary, because I've seen plenty of films, for instance, where you have the mysterious stranger who stays kind of mysterious, and his sole point in the film is to kick ass. But again, this is a movie that's concerned with being a character drama and a movie where you have a lot of ass kicking and people getting shot and brutally maimed and lit on fire and decapitated. Actually, I take that back. No one gets decapitated in this movie, but it doesn't matter, because there's all sorts of crazy shit going on. There's a fight in a police station where 2 cronies show up after the hero has been sort of taken into custody. He's chained to a table, and the assassins come for him. And the way that they go about it is they have a lot of the policemen in the station killed off screen, and they have a window in the background where you can see the muzzle flashes from the weapons as the assassins are coming, rather than showing it, while the chief of police or whoever it is who's interrogating the hero and the hero are in the room together, and the chief of police shows us a photograph about the hero saying, look, you're actually a part of this crime syndicate. You know, so we learn yet another connection between him and the antagonist. And at the same time, we get to imagine what's going on as these assassins are killing everyone else in the police station. And then later, when you have the fight between the assassins and the hero, you are shown the police station and all the dead bodies. You know, so there's a lot of great use of economy where there are certain things that are going on and you can't be at two places at once as an audience. And this movie really knows how to put you in the right place at the right time, because you can imagine what's going on with the assassins as they're cleaning house in the police station, and at the same time you're in an interrogation room with the officer and the hero, and you're finding things out about him as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's paced really well. And there's enough time to sort of develop tension as you realize that he's in danger, and you wonder what's going to happen, and you're kind of waiting. In the movie Brick, for instance, where everyone, Joseph Gordon-Levitt and the other characters are in the basement of this house, and they're having a sit down between these two sort of crime families, if you will. It's set in a high school setting, so you have the emo high schooler and the big jock sort of alternative ed type individual who are sitting down as what would you call figureheads or godheads of these crime syndicates, but it's told from a high school setting in that film. And a fight breaks out upstairs, but you don't see the fight. You can only hear through the walls, and then you hear a gunshot, and then everything gets really quiet, and the camera sort of focuses in on the doorway, and everyone, again, it's a great way to build tension. And in Headshot, they do a similar sort of strategy, and it's very economic, because you can keep, instead of cross-cutting and sort of jumping back and forth, you can keep the camera in one spot and still imply that things are going on elsewhere while you have things unfolding in front of you. So Headshot is very good at this. It's a very busy film, and it has a lot going on, but it doesn't feel fast necessarily. And I'm not sure, let's see, it's an hour and 58 minutes long. And for instance, I just watched Alien Covenant, which was about 2 hours long. Alien Covenant is a movie that has a lot going on. It's moving at a very quick pace, and you don't always have time in that film to sort of sit down and watch things unfold at a slower pace. So it feels like a very quick movie. By comparison, Headshot has a lot of stuff going on, and it's very economic, but it doesn't feel short. The length is just right with it, because again, there's a lot of different things going on, but it doesn't really draw attention to itself. You're just constantly engaged with the film. You're constantly learning things about the characters. You're constantly delighting at the really well shot action sequences. You're learning about new characters that are sort of introduced one at a time. And as the movie progresses, you feel, again, constantly engaged with what is a very entertaining film. Now, again, in regards to what I was saying earlier about Blade Runner, is this a movie that breaks any new ground? No, of course not. It has the iconic sort of use of the mysterious stranger and the patriarchal sort of father-like villain who sort of brings people close to him and sort of takes advantage of them. An old man who bullies children, as the hero calls him later in the film. And that's straight out of American History X. And the idea that in this film there are a lot of things that it's borrowing from other films. But then again, so did Blade Runner again. Philip K. Dick wrote a story that was adapted on screen, so they borrowed a lot of things and they changed a lot of things, and yeah, it's very influential. Well, congratulations. But again, it's not the most entertaining movie. I would watch it for certain reasons. But this movie, Headshot, is very entertaining. Yes, it's not breaking any new ground. It's not reinventing the wheel, but no movie really does, in the sense that a lot of the things that Blade Runner sort of invented, it didn't. It just borrowed from other things, and people have poor memories. So when I watch a movie like Headshot, and then someone makes the argument, well, I'm going to rate it lower because it doesn't reinvent the wheel, I feel as though that's pointless, because again, no movie really does. It just seems like they do. And ultimately, I would rate Blade Runner high because it's a very well-made film and it has certain reasons why I like it. But then I would take a movie like Headshot and I would say to myself, this is a really well-made film that knows how to be entertaining. It's very economical. It's very, it has a very interesting cast. It has characters that you actually care about. There's a lot of things to like about it. The one thing that you may say that discourages it is, again, its emphasis on ultra-violence, which, if that's not something that you're into, obviously you're not going to like this movie any more than if you don't like zombie films, you're not going to be interested in Dawn of the Dead because there's nothing really in it but zombies. And of course that's sort of a gross oversimplification, but if you watch, say, the original, there's more going on than that. Whereas in the 2004 remake by Zack Snyder, it's a little bit more straightforward. So if you were to sit down and watch the 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead, you know, it's really just about zombies. And yeah, there's some other stuff going on, and it's a pretty awesome horror film, if I do say so myself. But again, it's if you don't like that kind of thing, you're not going to like it. But it doesn't have to do with the fact that it's not a well-made picture, in the same sense that Blade Runner, if you're not interested in the kind of themes or topics that it's discussing, or if you're not a Philip K. Dick fan, or if you don't like architecture, you don't like sort of philosophical conundrums that are explored through hypothetical circumstances where you have individuals who aren't human at birth, but are human through the process that they result sort of parallel to, say, natural creation. You have unnatural creation. If you're not interested in stuff like that, it would be difficult for me to recommend Blade Runner to you. I don't care how canonical it is. It's just, that's how movies work. But when I sit down and watch Headshot, it's like, yes, it has a lot of super violence. It's also a really well-made film, and it's entertaining for a lot of reasons. But again, the violence is at the forefront, and it's sort of the focus of the film, or one of the focuses. You know, when it's time to throw down and kick ass, it's all about the ultra-violence. And when things slow down a little bit, you need some suspense. It does that very well, and it has characters that, again, are sort of stuck in this really violent situation, and they have to sort of find a way out. And when the hero sort of progresses from one crony to the next, he learns a little bit more about himself. We learn more about him. And it's an interesting sort of dilemma that occurs not just at a physical level, but a spiritual one. When he fights the first couple, you know, okay, he's just learning how to fight again. When he's on the bus, for instance, and he's trying to find out what happened to the nurse who gets kidnapped, and he doesn't really know how to fight. You know, he's still sort of getting his memory back, and then as he sort of knocks the rust off, so to speak, and he gets a little bit more proficient at regaining his old skills at being essentially a trained killer, then he starts meeting some of his old gang, some of the other assassins who do not have problems with memory loss or fighting. And every time he fights one of them, they're a little bit different. One fights with a knife, again, one fights with a combat baton, and he learns a little bit more about his relationship with them, and in turn we do as well, because again, this is a very economical film. It is having a fight in front of us, but again, we're also learning things as the fight's going on, and it allows the movie to sort of focus on the dramatic side of things too. It's not just people fighting for no reason. This assassin, for instance, when he confronts one individual, he says, you know, leave now, and I'll let you walk away from this. We don't have to fight. And we learn later that they were friends. And another assassin sort of, after the hero sort of triumphs over that individual, another assassin emerges from the shadows with a pistol and tries to shoot him, and it's a woman. And we learn that she was the one who put the bullet in his head to begin with. But there's more to it than that. And as they're fighting, we learn that, you know, why she shot him, and now she feels guilty about it. And as they're fighting, he's constantly like, I don't want to fight you. And it's that point in the film, of course, where it's like, okay, the hero doesn't want to hit the girl, and eventually she gives him no choice, and she pulls a gun on him, another gun, and she's like, okay, I'm going to shoot you, and he's like, okay, well, but he has a knife that he's taken away from her at this point. Well, he's sort of shielding his eyes, and she points the pistol to the side and starts blind firing, essentially, missing him on purpose, and he panics, of course, and starts waving his arms, and he throws the knife at her out of reflex and kills her. But before she dies, she says to him, now we're even. So there's this interesting sort of character drama that's unfolding in front of us at the same time that the awesome kung fu action is going on. So it's not just sound and fury. You know, it's like, yeah, there's plenty of sound and fury, but it signifies something because there's more going on behind all of the bluster and the explosions and the ass kicking. And at the same time, there's nods to scenes from famous films like Die Hard, the part where John McClane's under the table and the bad guy's like, ha, no more table. Next time you have a chance to kill someone, don't hesitate. They have a scene like that in the police station. And then, of course, the idea where you have a police station that's invaded by an assassin who's trying to find someone. It's kind of like Terminator. And there's nods to all sorts of different things. Not just Moby Dick, but Die Hard, Terminator, Ninja Scroll. You know, it's a movie that is very familiar with other films that have come before it. And again, that idea of reinventing the wheel. It's not so much reinventing the wheel as making use of things that already exist. And that's what Blade Runner did. So when people say that, oh, you know, it sort of broke the mold, it didn't break the mold. It just took an older mold and did its own thing. And it's an effective film, and people really responded to it. But that's very unpredictable, you know, the way that works. Because again, initially Blade Runner was a bomb at the box office. It bombed at the box office. It did poorly, and it was torn apart by critics. And the version that we saw in theaters wasn't the version that we got, where, you know, the idea where Deckard, for instance, has his narration or his overdub, and he sort of narrates things. Ridley Scott didn't want that, and then you get different versions of the film. It's the same idea with Seven Samurai, or The Wild Bunch, where you have different versions of the movie that have been edited by different individuals. It's like, well, which one is the good version? With Blade Runner, there's like 4 different versions of this movie, and the way that people sort of respond to it and say, hey, this is a classic, it's like, okay, great, that is a fact. You know, you can argue that, but it still doesn't reinvent the wheel, and it takes things before it in the same sense that Headshot does. Will Headshot be remembered as a movie that sort of ascends to the same type of strata as Blade Runner, in the sense that it will influence films, future films, for years to come? No, probably not. But it doesn't matter as long as that it's entertaining. You know, it's good for a different reason. You know, and Headshot has a lot of things to recommend. And yes, it's yet another movie of its type, in the same sense that, okay, you have Headshot, but then you had a movie like Crank 2 starring Jason Statham that was very similar in certain ways. I mean, that movie was a little surreal, and it wasn't so much a character drama. It's just a very, very violent popcorn flick. And I'm trying to think of other movies that are like it. The Raid, or um, I'm drawing a blank on other movies, but movies where violence is very much at the forefront, and yet it's also a character drama of sorts, and it tells its own story. It kind of reminded me of Man of Tai Chi, where you had the master who trains the man of Tai Chi to sort of unleash his violence, and then later, of course, the apprentice has to sort of stand up against his master. And Keanu Reeves, of all people. And it was actually, Man of Tai Chi was a really good film. Considering, you know, Keanu Reeves starred, wrote, and directed this movie, it was actually really solid. You know, a lot of people think of him as Bill from Bill and Ted, or was it Ted? I can't remember which one was which. I think he was, right, I remember now, I'm the Duke of Ted, and that's what he said. So he was Ted Theodore Logan. So he was Ted from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and people are like, okay, they don't really take him seriously, but he's a guy that can direct, in the same sense that Mel Gibson could direct when he wrote, directed, and starred in Braveheart, for instance, and or Bloodfather, you know, movies like that, where uh, it's like, again, these are all entertaining movies, and they don't rise to the same level of canonicality as something like Blade Runner does, for instance, in the same sense that Alien Covenant perhaps won't. But like Headshot, these are all really entertaining movies, and they're really well made, and they understand the material that they're working with. And my brother was a classically trained pianist who studied classical music from different genres, because you have classical music like Mozart, and then you have Beethoven, who was Romantic, and then before that you had Bach, who was Baroque, and you had Gregorian chants before that, and so on and so forth. And then you go forward, you have 20th century music like late Romantic, 20th century composers, you have Holst, and then everyone else after that. For instance, when I was watching Alien Covenant, they essentially were ripping off George Crumb. or Penerdicki, who wrote The Threnody for the Victims at Hiroshima. There's so much music out there that's been written. And part of the problem I have with movies like Blade Runner, for instance, is that people act like they're the only movie that's, it's so canonical that they can't see past it. It's like, okay, watch other movies to be entertained, guys. That's kind of what it's about, ultimately. That's one reason to watch movies. But you have people that don't watch movies to be entertained in the sense that I do if I sit down and watch a movie like Headshot. Okay, they want to sit down and watch Blade Runner, and then they want to celebrate it for its canonicality, and they want to defend that movie for it. And it's like, okay, great, fine. But I do think that at the same time, like the classical music that my brother told me about, there's so many composers out there that we don't really know about at a basic level as just an ordinary sort of vulgar audience. But if you were to study classical music, there's so many composers out there besides the greats like Beethoven or Mendelssohn or Bach or Vivaldi. Those are just the ones that everyone knows. But there were hundreds of others, thousands of others, and they all wrote a shitload of music that no one will ever read. And is it better because is Beethoven better because everyone knows about him? And okay, I'm not saying Beethoven doesn't deserve his fame. He cast a long shadow, but you have to keep in mind that shadow can get in the way of revealing other movies out there or other films out there or any kind of genre exercise, creative exercise that you want. You're going to have the greats, the classics, the canonical sort of authors or poets or filmmakers or musicians and their output, but you're going to have all this other stuff that's similarly good, even if it's not canonical. I mean, canonical is the result of a strange sort of phenomenon that doesn't necessarily determine the quality of something. It's just an interaction between an audience and a film on various levels. And it's like, yeah, okay, that's something that you can address and talk about, but you're also talking about something that isn't actually in the film a lot of the time. If I talk about Blade Runner and why it's famous, there's so many reasons as to why, and it's not just what's in the movie, it's how people respond to it and what they bring to it, in the sense that Wolfgang Iser talks about the virtual reality of the text, where you have the text itself and you have the person who's observing it, and it comes together to sort of synthesize, okay? And as far as that goes, something like Blade Runner, if you're talking about its canonicality, you're talking about the movie and you're talking about the audience responding to it, okay? But if you're interested in finding movies and just watching movies and experiencing things, there's more to it than just canonicality or what's front and center in the eye of, okay, what exists in this pantheon of great movies. It's like, yes, those are great, they're canonical, but they're canonical by virtue of the audience, okay? But if you just want to sit down and watch a good movie, it doesn't necessarily matter as far as whether something is canonical or not. Peeping Tom is not a canonical movie in the same sense that Psycho is, but it's just as good, and yet the shadow cast by Psycho would perhaps prohibit you from being able to sit down and watch this movie and take it seriously in the same sense because you're too busy looking at Psycho and saying that's a classic film. And I can totally say you're well within your rights to do so. It's your prerogative to sort of celebrate the virtue of this, but it doesn't mean that it's intrinsically better. It just means that people responded about it in a certain way, but it's made of the same type of components. Headshot, for instance, is made of the same type of components of movies that came before it. The palimpsest, movies like, let's see, The Wild Bunch, for instance, which is very sort of preoccupied with violence. It was directed by Sam Peckinpah, and yet it's also an economic film. It's interested in being a character drama and also sort of focusing on the violence, and it has its own kind of message. Headshot is the same kind of film, and it's very entertaining, and it might not be canonical and people might not sort of usher it into the Hall of Fame, but just because the Oscars say we award this film with Best Picture, and there can be a lot of reasons as to why in regards to how do people respond to it, it's ultimately political in nature. And as far as I'm concerned, just sitting down and watching a movie for what it is, I think that's separate from movies, okay? You have politics and movies, and that's a whole different thing that you can address. But if you just want to know if a movie's good or not or entertaining, that's a different way of looking at films. And I'm the kind of person that when I watch movies, I'm very much insistent on just watching movies for being entertained. And sometimes, when I sit down and watch Headshot, for instance, I'm just watching a movie in the same sense that if I sit down and watch Blade Runner, sometimes I'm not interested in sort of commenting on the canonicality of it. Sometimes I just want to be entertained. And at times I will confess that as much as I like Blade Runner and as much as you can make the argument that it's canonical and there's a lot about it that was determined by things outside of the film, to be perfectly honest, yeah, that's all good and great, but just sometimes I need movies like Headshot or Killers or movies like that. Killers is another movie that I want to review, and it again is a foreign film. And again, you have all these sort of American classics like Alien and Blade Runner. Well, what about movies from other parts of the world? Headshot is one example. Another movie I really liked was The Admiral, starring that guy who was the villain in I Saw the Devil and in a lot of other films, Korean films. He's very much a star in the same sense to Toshiro Mifune was a star of Japanese cinema back when Kurosawa was making hit film after hit film, and then after he stopped making hit film after hit film. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't watch Kurosawa films, and it doesn't mean that they don't have something to offer, even if his acme or his zenith is sort of descended or attenuated, and he's making sort of curiosities as opposed to classics. People do not set out to make movies like that, and when it does happen, you're capturing lightning in a bottle, and there's a lot of reasons as to why that happens. It's not so much to do with directorial intent, which is why you have Ridley Scott and people sort of pine for the days of yore when he made movies like Alien, and now he's making something like Covenant, and yet I can appreciate Covenant for what it is, in the same sense that I can appreciate something like Headshot. And when he made Alien, there was a lot of people involved with that project, and it's like, okay, and he has direct control now, true power as far as a director goes, and he's making his own kind of picture, and it may not be something that will respond or resonate in the same way, canonically speaking, as Blade Runner does or Alien does. But he's still making it. And with Headshot, this is another kind of movie where it's made as a love letter to the genre, in the same sense that Alien Covenant is a love letter to its genre, which would be something akin to, say, Hammer horror or dark fantasy, in the sense that Guillermo del Toro makes love letters to dark fantasy as well. And Hellboy, for instance, is an entertaining movie, but it's not quite as canonical as, say, Pan's Labyrinth, but it doesn't mean that it's not enjoyable. So sometimes you just kind of have to move out of the shadow of canonicality and just appreciate things for being entertaining, because movies can be entertaining or they can be canonical, okay? But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't watch both, because there's more to watching movies than just acknowledging that something is great or canonical. You also watch films to be entertained. There's a lot of different reasons. It's perfectly okay to sit down and watch something like Headshot, which again is an exercise as a love letter to a genre. It's incredibly well made, and yet, okay, it's derivative, and it feels a little bit more derivative than, say, Blade Runner, but Blade Runner is derivative, but it doesn't feel that way because, again, people have sort of put it on this pedestal where they give this sort of godlike status and they worship it, or Alien, or any movie like that, or Apocalypse Now, or Casablanca, and yet when Casablanca was made, it was very much performed in a rote method. There are plenty of movies like it that were being made, and yet people responded with it. And I'm not saying that their response isn't merited by things contained within the film itself. Okay? So yeah, Headshot. I really liked it. There's a lot of things to recommend. Sorry about the rant in regards to canonicality, but I feel as though it's worth addressing in regards to rating this, because I'll rate this the way that I rate most movies that I actually like, in that it's something that I would watch again, which isn't something that I can always say, because I've seen certain films, for instance, where, yeah, I kind of like them, but I probably wouldn't watch them more than once. This is a movie that I would happily sit down and watch again. It had me laughing. I really like the characters. Be they the protagonist, the antagonist, or supporting cast on either side of the fence. It's a very economic film that keeps you engaged in a lot of different ways simultaneously. It's very well shot. It's very violent. I love violence. And it knows the audience that it's addressing, okay? And it knows that, okay, you're the kind of person who's sitting down to watch my movie because it's violent. let's see how we can sort of play around with this. And it does a really great job of that. You know, and the fight scenes are great. I love Kung Fu movies, and there was a lot of interesting sort of photography where they had the camera guy that would sort of circle around in free motion as the people would be fighting, and he would be sort of moving, and it's all done in real time, like choreographed ballet, in the same sense that in I Saw the Devil you have the antagonist of that film having a knife fight with two guys in a taxi. While they're driving the taxi, and you have the car sort of rotating around them as they're fighting and stabbing each other. And I love that kind of stuff, you know, so it's full of shit like that. And again, it reminds me of Ninja Scroll, which is always a great thing because Ninja Scroll kicks ass. There's even that part in Ninja Scroll where Jubei and Gemma are fighting in the burning boat, and Jubei headbutts Gemma over and over until he smashes his skull and knocks his head through the floor of the boat. And then, of course, he regenerates and comes back to life. But there were moments in Headshot where the character's fighting people, and he's the kind of character who doesn't want to fight back in the same sense that Bruce Lee in Fists of Fury has his mother's necklace, and it's just an excuse for him not to kick ass, and then the necklace gets broken, and then he's like, okay, let's fucking party. And it's the same idea with the starring actor in this film, where he doesn't really want to fight, and he's trying to avoid his violent ways. But then characters give him no choice, and there's one guy that he has against the ground, and he's just punching his head, and his head just sort of caves in. And I was like, okay, another reason why it's like Ninja Scroll, and I loved it, you know. But I cared about the characters too. It's not just a violent movie that's completely pointless, you know. It's character driven, and you have these characters that were forced to be violent, and they contemplate their fates and why they side with this man who's essentially a monster, an old man who bullies children. And at the end, there's only one of them left, the protagonist, because all the other sort of children that the villain has sort of forcefully recruited into his little child army, they're all dead. So it's just the prodigal son returns, you know, his greatest student and his greatest disappointment, in the same sense that you had Lady Jessica in Dune, and you had Helen Gaius Mohiam, the Reverend Mother, who comes to test Paul, and she says to Lady Jessica, as though you could create the universal super being, the Kwisatz Haderach, how dare you, my greatest student, but my greatest disappointment. You know, so again, all sorts of shit that I loved about this movie. And I like that you had the damsel in distress who was captured at the end of the first act. And I kind of wondered if she would ever be put in a situation where she has to sort of fight back. And later on in the film, a man comes into the cell where she and a child are being held, and he puts down his rifle and he's going to rape her. And I thought, oh, okay, well, the child's just going to come up and grab the gun and shoot the guy. Well, no, again, this movie likes to sort of draw out its scenes in really creative ways. So the child comes up behind the guy, breaks a plate over his head, and then the guy turns around, has his attention on the child. The woman picks up a piece of the plate and starts stabbing the guy. He doesn't succumb from that, and then the child picks up the gun, and the henchman has the woman in a corner and is punching her, but then he turns around and sees that the child has the gun, so he turns his attention back on the child. But the woman grabs his ankles and trips him, and then she runs over, scampers over, takes the rifle. She points it at the guy, and you know, it's like click, click, it's not firing. Well, they turn the safety off, and then she blows the fucker away. And she has a chance to fight back, and then of course she escapes from the cell with the child. She's like, let's get the hell out of here. And you get to have a scene where the damsel in distress is causing distress for her captors. And at one point, the guy walks around the corner and she has a rifle pointed at him, and he's like, wait, wait. And she just shoots him. And it's kind of funny. You know, it sounds, you know, because she's turning the tables on her captors. And of course, at the end, the hero has to come in and sort of save the day because she runs out of ammo, and he has to take care of the rest of the bad guys, and he has to fight. You have to have a fight scene between the final villain and the final sort of last man standing, the protagonist. And of course, when they square off, they assume kung fu poses or whatever kind of martial arts that they practice in Indonesia. And you know, the dramatic music is kind of playing. It's not overly so, but it's there. And they have the poses, and they're like, yeah, you know, I can totally get into that because I love that in movies, you know, where it's like, okay, now these two get to fight. It's like, fight! And then they get to fight. But at the same time, it's not predictable in the same sense that you had Donnie Yen and Dragon, where in that film, it's very much concerned with another character who cuts off his hand to escape his violent past, to no longer be the hand of a violent crime lord, you know, the right hand, figuratively and literally. So he cuts his hand off, and then the crime boss visits his home later to collect his grandson from Donnie Yen, who at this point only has one hand, and he has to fight the crime lord. And it never really, during the fight, feels like Donnie Yen is in control of the fight. And at the end, he is unable to defeat the crime lord. He has help because he sticks the needle in the guy's throat, and then as the guy's about to deliver the killing blow to Donnie Yen, a lightning bolt strikes him and fries him. And yeah, it's Deus Ex Machina, but so what? It looked cool, and the fight scene was great. And I like that Donnie Yen wasn't able to beat him. In this movie, it's the same kind of idea when everyone's fighting, or you have the hero who's fighting the antagonist, and the hero is kind of winning, of course, but it takes its time, you know, and it draws the fight out just long enough that it's satisfying, but it doesn't sort of go over the required length. There was a fight scene in the raid, for instance, where you have the short little tiny dude and you have the two sort of hero characters who are fighting him, and the fight goes on for like 10 minutes straight. And I was just like, you know, this is really impressive because it's all shot in one take, and I can kind of like that. But think of the fight scene in Return of the Dragon where you have Chuck Norris versus Bruce Lee and they fight each other. It's not really that long. And of course, it's sort of drawn out, and there's some symbolic elements with the cat, and it's a little bit more structured, but it doesn't really take as long, just long enough. And in the raid, we have the little guy and he's fighting the two tall guys. It goes on for like 10 minutes, and I'm just kind of, after a while, I'm kind of looking at my watch, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, I like the raid. It was a good movie, but I remember a lot of people sort of celebrating it. And again, I'm all about entertaining films, but when I sat down to watch it, I just noticed things myself as a viewer. And one thing that I noticed, it's like, yeah, I like kung fu movies, I like super violent, but in this case, this fight scene's kind of taking its sweet time. And in Headshot, they didn't have that problem. And there was a lot of really cool photography, and again, free motion, and you'd have moments where the characters would fight each other. For instance, where the hero is fighting the character with the combat baton, and he's sort of blocking with his arms. And I thought, well, why is he doing that? Wouldn't his bones break? But you can condition bones so that they won't break immediately from, say, a nightstick. You know, get like a nightstick fracture. But if your bones are tough, you can do that. And yet at the same time, there were moments where it felt like, man, these characters are made out of fucking stone. But then there would be moments where the character, he breaks the nightstick over the owner's face and breaks his glasses, and the character dies from a concussion. And I thought, you know, you never have that in kung fu movies. It's always like a knife or a bullet. But no, he hits the guy, and he dies because he's concussed, essentially. And so I really like the variety in this movie in regards to the fight scenes. But at the end of the fight scene, the hero, takes the villain and throws him against a log, and it impales him. And you think, oh, okay, he's dead, and it's being all dramatic, and the villain's toast. Well, they have that final scare sort of moment. It's not even a scare so much as just a struggle, where the villain grabs the hero and is pulling him towards the spike, and you know, it's just millimeters from his throat, and you think, oh, he's going to get it. And this is a movie where other people have died in a similar fashion, and you have to ask yourself, oh no, is the hero going to die the way that these other characters did earlier in the film? And you're imagining that, and it's tense. But then the nurse comes up behind the hero and pulls him away from the villain, who then just dies. You know, he's just stuck to a log. And of course, there's a bit of doubt, of course, with her saving him, because she was angry at him. Because when she first rescues him earlier in the film, she thinks to herself, okay, you're innocent, and I liked you. You're just a guy I found on the beach with a hole in his head. And then she sees the good in him, even if it's not really there, ostensibly. but then he demonstrates his good by being the hero and sort of overcoming his violent nature. Again, very common tropes in stories like this. And she sees his violent nature and she's angry with him. And then, of course, the fight starts between the crime boss and the protagonist, and we don't really have a conclusion as far as that goes. So we still think that she's angry at him, but she forgives him and she pulls him away, saving his life, basically, because he was too weak to sort of resist the villain at this final juncture in the fight. So I like that. You know, again, where you have a character just like Donnie Yen in Dragon who's unable to defeat the final boss, so to speak, and he needs help. I like that. It's not like in The Expendables 2 where Stallone fights Jean-Claude Van Damme, they scrap, and then he just wins. You know, there's no attempt to make it look like he's going to lose. They just kind of square off, and he wins. And I'm not saying that I have a problem with that necessarily, because Bruce Lee always kicks the shit out of everyone in his movies, but he's Bruce Lee. You know, he's that bad. You know, he's just a bad motherfucker in the same sense that. But then you have character, or Jet Li is another example where, generally speaking, he just kicks the shit out of everyone he fights. And then, but you can also have characters like Jackie Chan, who make it a point to get their butts kicked in fights. You know, that they win, like The Legend of Drunken Master 2, where Jackie Chan fights his bodyguard, who's like this Taekwondo world master, and in real life, and in the movie he has to win by drinking the fuel that they use to light the forges, and he drinks it, and he he wigs out, but then he ends up winning, but just barely. And so Jackie Chan, you know, makes a habit out of making his characters a little bit more vulnerable, and I can always appreciate that in the same sense that in Headshot, yeah, this guy's a badass, but he's not, he has flaws, he has chinks in his armor, and he needs help. And I find characters like that to be much more interesting than characters in movies that where they're just indestructible. And I don't, in certain instances, I can appreciate that. Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator is ostensibly indestructible. Can you stop it? With weapons like these, I don't know. And with someone like the protagonist from Headshot, it was a nice sort of balance between badass and vulnerable. So it's just another reason to recommend the film, I think. Apart from that, though, yeah, you know, I think I could keep going, of course, but ultimately I like this movie. There's a lot to recommend. It's entertaining. I wouldn't call it canonical, but it's a movie that's very aware of the movies that come before it, and it kind of pays homage to a lot of them in a very economic, tight, concise style that is very expressive visually. It has a lot of good violence, and if you're into that kind of thing at all, you'll love this movie. You'll eat it right up. And it feels like a diamond in the rough, a hidden treasure, because again, there are so many movies out there that people sort of worship. You know, they place upon pedestals, and they say that these are great movies, rightfully so, and yet there's more than just worshiping classics, because again, they're classics for a variety of reasons, not always because of what's in the films. So with a movie like Headshot, there's a lot to like, and it may never be a classic in the same sense as Casablanca or Seven Samurai or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but it has a lot of the same things that make those movies great, even if it's not canonical. And I fully recommend watching it. It's a lot of fun, and again, it's on Netflix, so it's not like you don't have a reason to watch it. It's not like you have to pay to go and see it at the theater, for instance. So yeah, guys, check it out. I think you won't be disappointed. Anyways, if you like the video, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, or share. If you haven't subscribed already, anything you can do to share my content, I appreciate a great deal, as there's only so much of that I can do myself. And until next time, guys, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more reviews and other videos, as I feel like whatever I feel like talking about in regards to movies. Sometimes I do reviews, sometimes I go on long rants about critics and why I think that critics don't always get the message right and what they're trying to address, but sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So stay tuned for more, and thanks for watching, guys.